Morning.
Morning.
Peter, thank you. Good morning.
Uh, Hello, Wally, Todd, welcome. And to everybody who's watching, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. My name's Tracy, and I serve as Broad and Liberty CEO. I hope you'll indulge a few bumps along the way, as this is the first time that we're doing this. But I appreciate everyone taking the time to join us to hear more about this important matter. So today, we'll be discussing the current crisis behind the walls of Delaware County's George W. Hill Correctional Facility. Program itself will last about 40 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for open questions, open discussion with our guests, and we will conclude promptly at 11 a.m. Since the successful deprivatization effort culminated in a transition to county management in 2022, the George W. Hill Correctional Facility has faced unprecedented challenges, as highlighted by Todd Shepherd's reporting. There's been a marked increase of violence, a record number of inmate deaths, including multiple inmate suicides, severe understaffing, cost overruns, and on multiple occasions, the workforce has showed up at Delaware County Council meetings to discuss a situation that they see as deteriorating and increasingly unsafe. These issues have culminated in a security and humanitarian crisis that demands immediate public attention and action by public officials. Todd Shepherd's in-depth reporting on the prison has illustrated the degradation of safety and oversight at the facility in the years since the county government assumed operational control. As I mentioned, there's been an alarming rise in inmate suicides, from a total of 4 between 2015 and 2021 to 3 over the course of just 10 months due to severe gaps in supervisory protocols after county government assumed over the facility. Persistent complaints from unionized staff about low morale, as I just mentioned, compounded by the administration's inadequate response to what we would characterize as dire safety issues, and a series of violent incidents, including a noted 5-on-1 attack where inmates had time to clean up the scene before any intervention was able to be made by staff. The two gentlemen who are joining me today are Todd Shepherd. Todd, say hello, our chief investigative reporter.
Thanks everyone for joining the call.
And Wally Nunn. Wally was chairman of Delaware County Council for many years, served on the jail oversight board, and for a period of time served as chairman of Broad and Liberty's board of directors as well. Wally, thank you for being here this morning and bringing your expertise to bear. You know, the reason why we thought it was imperative to convene this particular event on this particular issue is we are a regional outlet, and in many cases we're covering statewide issues. And so on multiple occasions I received questions, you know, why are you spilling so much ink over what's going on at a prison in Delaware County? And while I believe that the nature of the crisis and in and of itself is enough to give it the coverage that we've given on our pages, and hopefully to stir public reaction and compel official action on the challenges at hand, there's also been a broader debate both in the Commonwealth and in the nation about privatization of prisons, the role of the profit motive when it comes to incarceration, and what ultimately is best for the public good. And so we thought convening this discussion would help to contextualize the issue beyond the walls of George W. Hill, beyond the walls of the Delaware County government building, beyond Delaware County itself, and touch on some of the larger issues about good governance and accountability and transparency in government that, frankly, as it relates to this issue, we've found to be too often. So let's move into the program without further ado. The way this is going to work is I'm going to parry questions back and forth between Wally and Todd. Start with Wally to allow him to set the stage based on his decades of experience in this particular subject matter area. And then, as I said, we'll open the floor for questions and discussion a bit later. So, Wally, if I may, can you please give us the historical background about how and why the prison was originally prioritized back in the 1990s?
Well, when I came to county council, one of the first subjects that council was addressing that I got involved with was the need for a new prison. Clearly, the prison was overcrowded. And if we didn't do something, certainly the feds would come in and make us do something. It was always better to do something yourself than do it under a gun. Right after I came into office, I went to a meeting with the architects and engineers that were designing the new prison, and they were estimating the cost at 95 to 100 million. And I looked at what they were drawing and so forth and so on. And I said, you know, you're making more room here per prisoner than we had in the row house I grew up in Upper Darby. And, you know, are you really sure that you're doing this as efficiently as possible? I was kind of mocked by the architects and engineers who told me that they had already worked this out with the staff and that I should talk to the staff. And I said, well, good. As I pushed my chair away from the table, got up and I said, you and the staff can also figure out how to finance it because I'm one vote against what you're doing. In any event, they later came back and said, well, geez, we can cut 30 or 40 million out if you really want to. Remember, architects and engineers are paid 10% of the value of the building they build. And that's how they're reimbursed under government. In Pennsylvania, it's a very bad rule. So they have every incentive to build a lot more than you need. I went home that weekend and my wife and in those days, I still read the New York Times. And I read an article about a private prison in Nashville, Tennessee. So I, at my own expense, I got on a plane, I flew down and spent a day visiting the prison. And I have to say, I hadn't really thought about this very much, but in the course of the day, I learned a lot. And one of the things I said is, why all the programs? Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? And they said, if you want to run an efficient prison, you've got to try to make the prisoners as stable and happy as possible. They're never going to be happy, but you need to have programs, you need to do things. And they really brought me along in understanding that the reasons that we spend a lot of money in these prisons actually ends up saving money because it becomes a less difficult place to manage. What sealed the deal for me is I went into the guards' dressing room as I was leaving to change my clothes to go to the airport and fly back. And there was a young, I think corporal, I think he might have been a sergeant, corporal, a young African-American. And I said, oh, how long have you worked here? And he told me 7 or 8 years or some number like that. And I said, oh, he said, but I'm about to be promoted. I said, oh, tell me about it. He said, well, it's a big corporation. They've offered me a promotion, but I have to move to Virginia. And then I thought, how much better it would be if we had an organization that allowed those that could to grow. Whereas if you have this small local organization, there's no real room for growth. So it was another thing that told me, wow, this is not a bad idea. So I came back to county council and met with the warden and one of the political leaders that was the chairman, Charlie Sexton, and others who all really fought me, didn't want to privatize it. They thought, this is not a good idea. I got them all to go to Nashville and see what was happening there. And they came back and said, you got a point. So we put out RFPs, and one of the things that we did, which was different, was we didn't want the private company to own the prison because companies might be good today, but they could be bad tomorrow. So I wanted the ability to either change the company running it or, as the county did, take it back and run it yourself if they weren't performing as you wanted them to perform. To make a long story short, they took the price from 95 to 100 million down to 55 million. That was a $45 million reduction in the amount of bonds we had to issue, something like $3 or $4 million a year for 20 years. and money that could go to other things that the county needed, that the local school districts needed, that whatever. And we ended up picking one of the contestants, and in this case, I think it was well, at that point, Wackenhut, and built the facility, and they began to run it. Just parenthetically, I had another interest in the prison in that in 1959, I actually was incarcerated there for a few weeks as a juvenile delinquent. And in those days, in the late 50s, they kind of threw the juveniles in with the adults if it made sense. And so I had sympathy for people that do things that get them into trouble, especially young men that don't have fathers like I didn't and have other difficulties and so forth and so on. So there was a desire on my part to, yeah, we need to incarcerate people, but let's make it as nice as we can. Believe me, the prison that I was in, the old prison in 1959, was not nearly what they have today. So that, along with the fact that I was going to take patronage out of it, somebody's, I'm not saying Charlie Sexton's nephew, but let's say that there's a politician that's got a nephew that needs to make more money. Well, they want him to be lieutenant of the guards.
Recording in progress.
What we eliminated that by taking a private company in. One of the other major things we did was, because suits happen all the time in a prison, is we had the company hold us harmless on any suits. So so that reduced by millions the amount of insurance we had to pay over the years, and it's certainly more than millions of suits that were successfully brought against the prison over the years, because the prison's a very difficult place and things happen. It's never going to be a good place. So essentially, that's how we got there. And I might add, by the way, a few years before I got there, the warden of the prison had gone to jail. Prisons are just a very, very difficult place to run. They bring to it a lot of issues from the community that sometimes are hard to manage.
Thank you, Wally, for that background.
Yeah.
Todd, as I mentioned, the question that I receive most consistently on this topic is, why are you guys spilling so much ink? Given how you decide to spend your time and which story you cover and why do you think it was the right thing for you to invest so much of your time and energy into this story? And what does that mean with respect to your coverage more broadly speaking?
Well, transitions by their nature in life are sort of chaotic in and of themselves, right? If you transition to a new home, if you move, it opens up some chaos and some opportunities for things to go wrong, even if you're being as diligent about it as possible. Transitions in government, for example, when a new majority takes over, or with a new partisan alignment, there are always bumps and interesting things that happen in the transition. So obviously, a transition of this kind was going to be more fraught. I mean, when you're dealing with the transition of managing a prison, and I'm not just saying, well, I was just hoping to pounce on the kinds of mistakes that might happen during a transition. But we definitely wanted to keep a close eye on things because, again, like I said, it's just a more fraught situation because of the people that you're dealing with and the safety and security of the county and all of those other things that are attendant with a prison. So then not long, I mean, it wasn't long into the county's management before our eyes were really opened wide that things were very problematic. Very quickly, you had the murder of Nathan Funkhauser, and then you had the two suicides in June of 2022, and those were of Andrew Little and Patrick Langworthy. And I think one of the watershed moments for me was after we had reported that there had been the two suicides, Little and Langworthy, but and we tried to do what coverage we were able to at that time with what little information we had from the county. But there was no coverage of these suicides in the Delaware County Daily Times, as I remember it. And so at that point, it really starts to weigh on us that not only do we have the opportunity to cover something that no one else is covering, and I should just sort of step aside for a quick 30 seconds and say, because I am the only full-time reporter at Broad and Liberty, the way we try to manage my story selection, one of the first things we ask on any story I might do is this something that I'm going to have kind of exclusively, so that when you see that story, you'll say, the only place I read that was Broad and Liberty, or the only place I could have read that was Broad and Liberty. We don't want to do a story that 3 TV stations and 2 newspapers have already done. So in this case, it sort of became apparent to us that we had this field to report on our own, and that's not a good thing. That's kind of a tragic circumstance, really. And then given the weight of what was happening, now I don't want to say the Delaware County Times didn't report on the Funkhauser murder. They certainly did on that, and their reporting was very good on the Funkhauser murder when that first happened. I'm talking mostly about the 2 June 2022 suicides. But still, once we had an indication that life and death issues at the prison were going to potentially not be covered robustly by the paper of record in Delaware County, I think that's when we said to ourselves, we've got to really up our attention on this. The last thing I'll say on this is, in 2023, it was a little bit more of a political year for my coverage because of the campaigns and so forth. I find off-year elections are a little bit busier year for Broad and Liberty, because we're more interested in we'd rather report on municipal and school board elections than the presidential election. And so in the summer and fall of 2023, I was gathering a lot of information through right to know requests. But because of our political coverage, I didn't really have the time to sit down and give it a full analysis and to go through it all. And then what really turned a corner for us was in January of 24, a source got in touch with me. This source sought me out on their own. I think that always says something on its own. That again tells you a little bit of how troubling and how chaotic the situation had become. Was that a source sought me out, and not long after that, a second source sought me out. It was quite serendipitous. And once I got connected with those sources, I was able to take all of those documents that I had accumulated the previous year, and then at that point, all sorts of puzzle pieces started to come together.
Wally, when it became clear that the county would indeed deprivatize, what was your 1 or 2 biggest concerns about what could go wrong?
Well, let me set that up. I talked to people at the county. I talked to the Philadelphia Inquirer. I gave them information from third-party sources that talked about that. Everybody needs to know, according to the Department of Corrections, which has been run for the last 6 years by Democrats, so this isn't party related, has said consistently that it was, if not the safest, one of the safest prisons in the Commonwealth. As a matter of fact, the last time I could fight with these people, I showed them a letter from the director of from the Department of Corrections that said, "You guys are doing so well. This is almost unheard of. We're going to forego examining you next year and skip a year." There were outside accreditation sources, the ACCA, a medical outside source, all of which were giving these people pretty good numbers. Now, nothing's perfect. It's a prison, so it's difficult. And but all of it was ignored. The Inquirer totally ignored everything. That surprises me. And County Council totally ignored it. And so did the advocates that were there daily, screaming that, the thing is so bad, the only way to fix it is to put the public in charge. I just want to interject this. There was a gentleman that unfortunately died on the street in Milwaukee, which caused an uproar in this country. We have a young man, 26 years old, Mustafa Jackson, who died in the Delaware County Prison. Let me give those listening the description that we got after a year of the county refusing to allow us to have the autopsy. Let me tell you what the autopsy said. He was found face down in a cell by himself in a diaper, surrounded by used and unused catheters. And he had died of urosepsis. And anybody can look it up. It's an incredibly painful disease. It doesn't come on in a second. They clearly knew this young man who was a paraplegic. And look, I'm sure he was a very difficult individual. I have no doubt. But they knew this young man was ill. Yet he was unsupervised, not in the medical unit, and left there by himself to die. It's almost medieval. And this poor guy that died in Milwaukee died in a few minutes. This young man may have taken days of agony to die. And nobody cares. District attorney's not investigating. U.S. attorney's not investigating. State attorney general's not investigating. Is it because this, I call it a crime? Is it because it was perpetrated by Democrats? I don't know. Why isn't there an outrage about what's happening in that prison? When the guards come in and say it's not safe, why isn't there something being done? Why haven't they changed who's running the prison? We did a very simple thing when they first hired the warden. We Googled her. There was case after case where she was named in issues that are very similar to what we're talking about.
In her prior role.
She came from, she was deputy warden in Allegheny County, a prison that had a much worse record than the Delaware County prison. We go and hire somebody from a prison that's apparently managed much worse and put them in charge of a prison that's managed much better. There's an insanity here. The only reason that anybody can give me that they did this is it was because they didn't think it should be privately run. Every other, up to and including what it's called, it has taken, I've done the numbers. They used to have 1,800 prisoners. Now they have 1,200 prisoners. It went from roughly $76 a day per prisoner, and it's almost $130 a day now. And they haven't even begun to have to pay the suits that they're now going to have to pay that used to be paid by the private company. So this is a disaster for the prisoners, for Mustafa. This is a disaster for the people that work there. And this is a disaster for the people that on county council ultimately ought to be caring about, the people that live in the row houses that we grew up in, where a couple of $100 in taxes means an awful lot. It means whether you're going to buy your kid a Christmas present, whether you're going to get medicine, it means a lot. It doesn't mean much to people in Radnor. It doesn't mean much to people. I'm sorry, I'm getting excited, but I am. It doesn't mean much to people in Swarthmore. It doesn't mean much to people in Haverford. And you know the three council people I'm talking about there. Because what's a couple $100 more to them? What is important is ideological purity. We're not here to deliver the services that the public needs. We're here to be ideologically pure, to create whatever we think we have to create to make that perfect world that dances around in our heads. And then we can all go to our cocktail party, pat ourselves on the back and say, oh, what a good job we did. Well, you didn't do a good job. You messed up the prisoners, you messed up the people that work there, and you messed up the taxpayers.
Todd,
so you just resign.
Todd, Wally brings up the issue of Mustafa Jackson's death, which you spent, as he mentioned, almost a year unearthing to the best of your ability, what exactly happened to that individual. How did that? It was a key inflection point in our coverage of what's been going on there in many ways, right? Speak to that and speak to how the facts as they revealed themselves has influenced your coverage since.
Well, it just starts off by we get notice that there was a death in the prison, and I'm just doing routine asking of the county what's going on, what was the cause of death. The couple of times I've done this previously, before Mustafa died, and his death was February of 23, I believe. So, when the county had already proved that it was recalcitrant to offer information when there was a suicide or death, and it got worse with Mustafa. There seemed to be this delay, and then finally I just get the notice that his death was declared a delayed homicide. So what they said was, and we only found this out. Well, I guess no, they did say this in an email that Mustafa had been shot sometime a couple of years before.
2019, I believe.
What's that?
2019, I believe.
You're right. I think it was in Philadelphia, and quite honestly, we've never even been able to track that down, which is odd in and of itself. But it was only because of that, because of that court case, Haler versus Allegheny County, where a journalist was trying to get an autopsy from Allegheny County. And I won't bore everyone. Again, thanks to everyone that's on. I'm glad you're on. I won't go into the nitty gritty details, but there's just a little quirk in Pennsylvania law, used to be, that counties of the first and second class have medical examiners, and the medical examiners don't have to give over their autopsies. But the county coroners in all of the other counties do. And this case from Allegheny County sort of broke that mold, and now medical examiners do have to give over their autopsies. They can charge a $500 fee per autopsy. We paid that. And that's when we see that the underlying cause was urosepsis, and we see the conditions of his cell and so forth. I think Wally's absolutely right that there, the question of where's the outrage, this just happened to be in the county's favor, and I don't mean to say that ironically or in a pejorative manner, but Mustafa Jackson, we still have not been able to locate any next of kin. The one brother I think he may have had in this area may have died, and I can't even get clarity on that. So in other words, in other cases where you might have someone who can come forward and voice that outrage on the deceased behalf, there was no one like this in this case. And that also had significant legal consequences. I mean, a next of kin would have had great legal ability to get various information about Mustafa's last days. They would have been able to get the autopsy immediately without having to pay the fee, right? Whereas we had to go through a months-long process. But that's, again, where we saw that once we started to put more of these pieces together, that there was a real breakdown. CPR, for example, wasn't administered on Mustafa until 5 minutes after his body was discovered. If that's a routine time if that's a routine lag time, that would seem to be problematic. But I'll finish by saying this is, and I'm sure Wally will probably want to say something after I bring this up, but to the best of my recollection, and I would need to check my emails on this, but it seems to me that I reached out to the Delaware County Coalition for Prison Reform, which this is the nonprofit. I don't know that they're exactly a 501c3 nonprofit, but essentially they're just a community organization, and they advocate for various prison reform, and they were lead in advocating the deprivatization. I really have, in the many times that I've emailed them on the number of stories that I've done, one time, and I can't even remember what story it was, they emailed back and they just said, we declined to comment on this case. The kinds of things we've exposed, the kinds of tragedies. And let me go back to the Little and Langworthy suicides for just a second. In each of those suicides, I found problems with the response, like, you know, a cell door that was, the lock was broken and it delayed the first responders, their ability to get in the cell and potentially administer life-saving aid. And in all of these horrible anecdotes, the Delaware County Prison, or the Coalition for Prison Reform, where they once were vocal, they are not anymore. They are not to be seen, really.
Well, in fact, I believe they were part of a report that the Delaware County Times did sometime last year that was hindsighting what the statistics were coming out of the prison. And the only public comment I've seen from them in the course of the events that we've been discussing this morning is that on average, these numbers are sort of normal, which is what the Times put out sometime last year. Wally, to that point, you know, the Coalition for Reform, the Jail Oversight Board, in addition to county council itself, what other organizations should be playing a role here in demanding change or reform, accountability and transparency, and or not? And to what extent do they share responsibility for the outcomes that we're currently getting?
Well, I mean, obviously, county council, where are they? You know, sometimes you make a mistake. They apparently made a mistake, at least in the leadership that they put in place. Why have they said nothing? I mean, one council member has appeared to stand up, but where are the other four? Why are they not saying this? But I'd also say yeah, by the way, just parenthetically, also the first ever murder of an inmate by another inmate, and clearly, and Todd could probably speak to this better than I, the two should not have been put in the same cell together. And Todd, you might want to go back to that in a minute, but where is the district attorney? Why is there not at least an investigation into Mustafa's death? To me, it's, you know, I'm suspicious that it's willful manslaughter, that this guy was a problem. We have through Right to Know information that he had difficulties with some of the people there, and he was probably a very difficult young man. But that doesn't mean you can kill him. I mean, you know, so where is the investigation from from the U.S. attorney, from the Civil Rights Commission? Where? But ultimately, it goes back to county council. Why has county council allowed this to fester? And it's hurting the three groups that they're supposed to be concerned about: the prisoners, the guards that work there, and the taxpayers who fund government. So I mean, to me, it doesn't get any further than that.
And what about Wally? What about the role of the Jail Oversight Board? I mean, we don't know what goes on in executive session. It's possible some of these issues are being addressed, but at least so far as we can track in the public record, there's been very little discussion of these issues over the course of the last year and a half.
I tortured myself by listening to a few of them. Nothing gets said there. I don't know what gets said in an executive session, but it's pablum. She comes out, everything's wonderful, everything's great. For instance, every month we used to give, before the deprivatization, the how short we were of staff. And by the way, every prison in the country is short of staff. It's an incredibly difficult job. How we get people to take this job is beyond me. It's not a job I think I could handle. And you know, we've got to be thankful to the people that will do it. But, you know, they refuse to tell us how short they are of staff. But every month, no less a genius than Madden would come in and question why we didn't have full staff. Well, Mr. Madden, why don't you have full staff now? You won't tell us how short you are, but apparently you're very short. Every month, the advocates that Todd talked about would come in, mock us, talk about among a lot of things, but not the least of which is the staffing. But none of this is discussed in the public meetings that used to be discussed in the public meetings when it was private. So this is not good government. So county council get off its button.
While Wally mentioned the homicide in the prison, touch on that for a minute before we open it up for Q&A. And also, if you could speak to how things have changed now that you've broken these stories in terms of how you're still trying to report on the prison going forward.
Bring me back to the homicide in just a second, Terry, because I just want to touch on something, continue on the theme that Wally was going on there for a second. And I know we're getting close to questions time. And I feel like we've still, there are so many factual things to get into.
Barely scratched the surface. Yeah.
What's that? Yeah.
Barely scratched the surface.
But, I was talking to someone that is an advocate for private, that is an advocate for private prisons. I won't name this person, but they did bring up what I thought was an interesting point. And I don't bring this up. I'm not trying to advocate for privatization, but they said, look, think about the way our jury trial system works, and it's adversarial, right? The defense versus the plaintiffs, or the government versus the defense. He said, what you have in a privatization system is the county council is kind of naturally adversarial to the company. That's not to say they're hostile, but when the government is the management, at that point, and I'm not trying to accuse the county or the prison right now of any kind of cover up, but suppose there were, it's more fluid at that point, and the county and its staff are more aligned possibly in trying to project a good image to the public. So I don't know, I just thought that was a very interesting argument for privatization, because Wally's right, I would have expected more a robust response from the district attorney's office, and we haven't seen it. And that takes me right back to the press conference that Stephanie Michkowski gave on the steps of the county building. And
Todd, you may have frozen there.
Todd did freeze.
Yeah. While we wait for Todd to come back, I wanted to touch on one more thing before we open it up for questions related to what Todd was just talking about. And Wally, perhaps you can jump in here. But there's this debate over how the county is counting deaths in the prison, right? And in Todd's reporting, one of the things that we learned is that there's been I was just talking about, there might be this bias towards putting
Well, Todd's back. Let him.
Oh, Todd, are you back?
yeah, I hope so.
Sorry. If you want to finish your thought, but where I was going with Wally while you froze there for a minute, you were talking about this inclination maybe to paint a better picture than actually exists for public relations or political reasons or what have you. And that led me to think about the issue of how the county is actually counting deaths that occur in the facility, right? And this idea that once an inmate who may be in critical or life-threatening condition is off the campus itself, the county is no longer required to count that as a death if they should pass away in a hospital or under some circumstances outside of prison walls. That's a technicality there that seems to have been an interesting piece of how your engagement with county officials on the tracking here.
Let Todd answer that, because he's got specific examples. Todd?
Yes, please.
Yeah, anyone that's interested in the question Terry just asked should, go to Broad and Liberty, and in the search tool, type in Patrick Langworthy. It's spelled exactly like it sounds, and read that story, because Patrick Langworthy attempted suicide in the prison. He was taken out of the prison almost immediately. We have emails that I obtained by Right to Know that show the warden trying to get him released from all charges. And by doing this, if he's released, he's no longer in the prison's custody, because he's not considered a prisoner anymore. And so Langworthy goes to the hospital, and he lingers for a couple of days before he passes. Now, the prison will tell you, and there is some truth to this. I'm not going to say that this is not completely false. They will tell you that, well, we want to get him released so that the family can be with him bedside. there is a small humanitarian, a reasonable humanitarian reason for this. But it is also true that it is greatly in the prison's benefit to get those releases as soon as possible, because if that happens and the inmate dies, they do not have to count it. And when I pressed the county on this, they just said, hey, we adhere to the law. And I'll tell you this much too, is my sources on the Langworthy death, my prison sources, they said, we heard, like the rumor for a year after he died was that the warden had tried to get Langworthy off the books, so to speak. And it wasn't until I published those emails and two of my sources came to me and they said, this, you proved what we suspected. Now, I can't prove exactly what the warden's motivation is in this case, okay? So I mean, all I've done is put these things out there for the public to judge. But my prison sources, they didn't know for a year whether Langworthy was counted on the prison's annual death tally. And then they finally found out through our reporting, and they saw those emails. And when they did, I can tell you they lost that of the tremendous respect that had already been lost for Warden Williams. It deepened tremendously after that report. I don't say that in any way to try to flatter myself or for me to puff up my pride. I'm telling you what those sources told me. And I know we've got to get to questions, but Wally brought up that homicide. Again, you know what, let's go to questions anyway. I'll bring it up in questions if I can.
Okay.
We gather my thoughts.
We do have about 15 minutes for questions. So if now would be a time if anybody has an issue they'd like to discuss, follow-up questions, things we've not brought up but have been covered, to please go ahead and submit them through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And while we wait for things to come in, Todd, why don't you finish?
Yeah. So again, this is the Nathan Funkhauser, the murder that happened in 2022, just months into the government's full takeover. I think it was about 8 weeks ago that I broke the story where, you know, when the Funkhauser death first happened, the Inquirer reported that there was some doubt as to whether those two people should have been housed together. Our report moved that reporting incredibly further. We spoke to a guard that's no longer employed at the prison, and he told us his story of how he specifically, you know, when he got the radio call, hey, we're moving Funkhauser into the cell with Bocella. And he basically said, hey, we don't have room for any house alone rec-alones. House alone rec-alone means they have to be isolated. So we don't have any room for house alone rec-alones. And then his shift ends and he leaves. He comes back over the weekend and he sees that there's crime tape over the cell. I can tell you that in my many phone conversations with this guard, about 3 times he broke down in tears because he felt like he felt responsible. Like he knew that those two couldn't be housed together. And he feels like somehow, and I told him, I said, look, you told them what you knew. And he says he did. He even wrote an incident report when he came back just to make sure that it would be on the record that he said, I told them. He wanted accountability. But the toll of some of these deaths, these suicides that it's taking on the guards, I can tell you, it is tremendous. There are many, many nights of lost sleep by some of these people. And I'm talking about people who are innocent. They're just struggling with the fact that so much is going wrong in the facility and they feel like it shouldn't be this way.
Wally, question for you. Broad and Liberty has recently reported that there may be significant tax increases in the county. What role does the prison play in those increases?
My estimate is that there's a structural deficit in there, even including the 5% tax increase they had this year, of something between 60 and 65 million. Now I'm doing that from the outside, but I've got a little experience in this. And I would say of that, probably 10 to 15 million is the prison. So, that's 7 or 8% tax increase, 10% tax increase. that you would need to cover the inefficiencies of what they're doing at the prison. And everybody has to understand too, that they were when it was privately run, they were housing 1,800 prisoners. They're now only housing 1,200 prisoners. So despite the fact that it's decreased by a third, the cost has increased by 20%. So per prisoner, they went from $76 a prisoner to close to 130. So it's a significant part. And by the way, I think no less worthy than Christine Ruther said recently that there are going to be at least a 19% tax increase this year. They need more than that, but maybe they can hide it for the election and use some artifice and device to get them through so that the other 10 or 15% they need could be the following year.
And let me jump in real quick and say that, one of the most recent reports we did, and again, we're still the only outlet to report this, which astonishes me, but the estate, the family of Nathan Funkhauser just filed suit for his 2022 death a couple of weeks ago. And so, when Wally talked earlier about the lawsuits that the county's going to have to pay for, the Funkhauser one seems like the most certain, where the county it has real liabilities that, very genuine liabilities that they could face here in a lawsuit. So a settlement would be costly, and a jury trial or a bench trial even could be very, very costly to the county. And I remember when I asked the county about this once, when they were considering deprivatizing, I said, how do you budget for that? And they said, well, taxpayers always pay for the cost of lawsuits. It's just in the previous deal, it was built into the contract. I mean, that's true to a degree, but when you're talking about a privatization, a private company that manages, let's say they manage 100 prisons nationwide, there's kind of an insurance effect that comes into play. I mean, the wide company is taking, is making the profits at the corporate level. And they may have 90 prisons where there are no incidents. And so, in other words, those are kind of the prisons that are paying into the insurance pool. And it's the other 10% of the prisons where you have to make the payouts, right? So it's almost like you start to involve a law of large numbers. And that doesn't apply when you get to the county level. I mean, they're responsible for every single suit.
Well, there's some good news for some people in this. The last year that the Republicans ran county council, they spent $400,000 in outside law firms. We don't have last year's numbers yet, but I bet they're cute. But the year before, the county spent 3.2 million on law firms. So all of these suits that we're talking about is going to allow those on council that have friends in these very expensive downtown law firms to continue to reward them for their political contributions.
Todd, there's a question of jurisdiction. Wally mentioned the lack of investigations and the U.S. Attorney's Office and the District Attorney's Office. Have you engaged with anyone from those investigative bureaus? And is there something going on potentially that the public's not yet aware of that you can speak to? Who would have jurisdiction over these types of issues?
Well, let's start with the fact that in a lot of for almost any sort of critical incident, like let's take that 5-on-1 inmate fight, or you could even point to the suicide of Patrick Langworthy. The jail can call CID from the Delaware County DA's office to come investigate, and they should have done that in the suicide of Patrick Langworthy, but they didn't. Quite honestly, when we published that report, that we had a document that showed CID was not called to investigate Patrick Langworthy's death. In my opinion, that was a fireable offense for Warden Williams right then. That was an astonishing breach of protocol. It's a good question, but the district attorney's office, being the top cop in the county, they do have a lot of tools at their disposal to initiate investigations into what's going on at the prison. And certainly they ought to be called in those kinds of circumstances. So to the degree that the county's district attorney's investigators would interface with the prison, that's one area of jurisdiction. But all of my requests for contact or my requests for comment from the district attorney's office, I've gotten nothing. I mean nothing. The only thing I get from them is when I request an affidavit, and they're more or less legally obliged to provide that. But they've never engaged in any dialogue. Consider the fact that we put out, they gave us a comment one time. So I said nothing before. I was in error there. I should amend those remarks. We published a story that showed the number of chargeable offenses that were being, actual court cases that were coming out of incidents from the prison, right? So like if one prisoner attempts to murder another, you would file attempted murder charges on that offending prisoner, and the address would be 500 Cheney Road or whatever it is. The last 3 or 4 years of private run, I don't know, it was something like 40 or 50 cases. The first 2 years under government management, it was 200 cases. Now, the DA's office said, we're very pleased with the open lines of communication we have with the prison and the county council after the transition. But that was a sidestep of all of the pointed questions I had asked them. So while they did provide that response, it was a sidestep of the very granular questions I asked them. The other thing I would say about that is, I would think that the DA would want to, given he's running for Attorney General, he would want to be out front on some of these things, but he has not. The last thing I'll say about the discrepancy between the privatization, the cases in privatization and the cases under county, someone said to me, well, GEO was undercounting cases when GEO was the operator, when they were in power, and that's why it would have been 200 otherwise. I think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. I think cases probably could have been a little bit higher under privatization, but 200 or whatever it was, and I'm sorry, I'm just kind of pulling that number out of memory. I don't have it in front of me right now. But whatever it exploded to during the first 2 years of government run, it was extraordinarily high. And I can tell you that, and I just never was able to piece this enough together for an actual story, but multiple sources were telling me, it was a little bit of hearsay. I couldn't put this in an article, but they were saying, we're hearing that investigators at the DA's office are concerned about the number of cases. I'm telling you that anyone who's hearing that from me, you should take that with the grain of salt that was hearsay information to me, and do not take that to the bank. That's it. It's secondhand information.
We have time for one more question. And Wally, I'm going to kick this one to you. What would you do to fix it? And I'll ask you to sort of segue into the broader ideological debate here. Brought up the issue of ideology here a couple of times. And there is a debate raging across the nation about both the appropriateness and efficacy of private prisons, the idea of a firm making a profit off of the incarceration of individuals, in addition to what actions you would take. Can you help us to understand what's really going on here in this broader debate and how it should be, how perhaps in light of the information that's been brought forward today, people should rethink it?
Well, first of all, as to the debate, the only legitimate point that the anti-privatization people have is a philosophical one, which is that there should not be profit made off of having prisoners. And we're a free country where debate is important, and I understand that they can have that opinion. I don't have that opinion, but that's an opinion they have. Because if really one looks at the broad numbers, especially we've got them right here, it's not a case that it's better. It's apparently worse. With that said, we're never going to get a private company to ever come in here and want to run this prison again. I mean, given the reception and given what's happened locally and given the advocates and so forth and so on, no, there are only a couple of private companies that would have the means to come in here in any event. And given the way that they've been treated, why would they come back? They won't, which means we're going to have to run it ourselves. So the very first thing I'm going to say, if I was chairman of county council right now, I'd make a change at the top at the prison immediately and begin a search for someone that can bring some semblance of sanity to a situation that's clearly gotten way out of hand. And I think the only people that can do that are the county council. They're in charge. You might have that board, oversight board or whatever you call it, but ultimately county council makes these decisions, and they need to say, look, we made a mistake, we've got to make a change. We're never going back to privatization, so there's no sense talking about that.
Todd, any closing remarks before we wrap here?
No, I think the Wally is hitting it on the head there, that the issue, all of my reporting seems to come back to issues with the warden, and that there hasn't been more questioning of some of her decisions in the public eye by the jail oversight board. Like, I would point to split shifts. Since we've got 2 more minutes, let me just give a quick description about this. Let's say there are 3 shifts. Okay, there's just 8. You know, the day is split into 8 hours, 8-hour shifts. The first is 8 to 4. The second is 4 to midnight, and the third is midnight to 8. Now, let's say Wally works midnight to 8, and I work the 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. shift. Now, the jail sometimes has to have mandatory overtime shifts. So let's say I work my 8 to 4 shift, and then they tell me, hey, you've got a mandatory 8-hour shift after that. That means I would then have to stay and work from 4 to midnight. That's grueling. If I leave at midnight, I might not even get home until 1, might not fall asleep until 2, and I've got to get up at 7 to be back to work at 8. Now, what they used to do was you could split the shift. So of the 8 hours, I could call Wally and say, hey, instead of you doing 12 to 8, can you come in 4 hours early and pick it up and work 8 to 8? And then I would just work 8 to 8 as well. So you see the difference? Wally works 12, I work 12, but it saves me from working a 16-hour shift, which it's just, I mean, I can't remember the last time I worked a 16-hour day. I was 21 probably, you know, and it was hard to do then. And what really hit it for me was when someone said, the new people that are being brought on board, when they work their first mandatory overtime shift and they realize they can't split, they're out. And the fact that this is driving their retention crisis and that they haven't fixed it yet, that tells you that this is a management problem. So I'm sorry to get back into like a factual thing there right before we end. I know when we were looking for big themes, but it is it appears to be a management issue right now, and it appears to be that Kevin Madden is very protective of his very first pick for warden, and all of her glowing profiles in the Inquirer would be all for naught if she is let go within the first 2 years of her coming on board.
We'll have to leave it there. Wally, Todd, thank you for your expertise, your insight, your analysis, and to everybody who joined us today for On Liberty Live. Thank you very much for your time and your interest in this matter. We would ask that you spread the word about our coverage and about the importance of this issue in your networks and your communities. And we'll keep doing what we do here, which is, as Todd mentioned earlier, bring information and cover stories that nobody else in the media landscape here in Southeastern Pennsylvania does. With that, have a great day. Enjoy the rest of your morning. Thank you again, and we will talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.